When they saw the face of the corpse, the world stood still for a moment. This was impossible. This couldn't be. And yet the truth lay before them, cold, lifeless, and utterly shocking. The one they thought was dead might never have died, and the one who seemed alive might never have truly lived. Was this merely a case of murder, or the beginning of a deadly game where every step led closer to death? The morning mist slithered through the winding streets of St. Mary Mead, thick as wool, softening the edges of the tidy cottages, and cloaking the village in an eerie stillness. It clung stubbornly to the ground, curling around the roots of ancient oaks, whispering through the hedgerows like a ghost reluctant to depart. The air carried the damp scent of earth and distant rain, but there was the promise of warmth, a deceptive sort of spring morning, where the world felt unhurried, as if time itself was holding its breath. Inside her snug parlour at the corner of the village square, Miss Marple sat comfortably in her well-worn armchair, the floral upholstery faded but familiar, cradling a cup of tea between her slender fingers. The tea was darker than she preferred, slightly over-brewed, but she paid it no mind. The scent of old books, polished wood, and a hint of lavender from a sachet tucked away in her drawers gave the room its usual comforting aroma, a sanctuary of quiet contemplation. Through the window, the village stretched out in its usual way, neatly kept gardens, white picket fences, and rooftops still glistening with the residue of morning dew. The rhythmic sound of the postman's boots echoed along the cobbled path, steady, deliberate. He moved with the ease of a man who knew every resident's routine as well as his own. His nod to Miss Marple was habitual, neither warm nor indifferent, just the resigned politeness of a man who had long accepted his role as the bearer of mundane correspondence, and on occasion, unwelcome news. She returned the gesture, her gaze lingering as he trudged on, vanishing into the mist-laden streets. Then came the letter, a crisp envelope, white as bone, with an indigo wax seal pressed firmly upon it, slid through the mail slot, landing with a quiet finality upon the polished wooden floor. There was something oddly out of place about it, not in its presence, but in its nature. It wasn't the usual friendly note from a neighbor, or an invitation to tea. No, this was something else, something heavier. Miss Marple's fingers brushed over the seal before she carefully pried it open. The name on the letterhead caught her attention at once, Colonel Marchmont of Maplewood Manor, a distinguished man certainly, but not one she would consider an acquaintance beyond the occasional village gathering. The Marchmont family, though deeply rooted in St. Mary Mead, had always remained somewhat apart from the close-knit village of Furriers, their grand estate standing like a silent sentinel on the outskirts. Her sharp eyes flicked over the carefully worded letter. "Dear Miss Marple, I hope this letter finds you well. I would be most grateful if you could join me for tea at your earliest convenience. There is a family matter I would appreciate discussing with you. Yours sincerely, Colonel Marchmont." There was something about the wording that unsettled her. Polite, yes, but with an undercurrent of urgency. This was no casual invitation, it was an appeal, and appeals were never made lightly, not by men like Colonel Marchmont. Her fingers tightened around the letter as she read it again, weighing the meaning between the lines. Family matter, a vague phrase but one heavy with implication. Setting the letter down, she reached for her tea, but found it had already gone cold. Outside, the mist had begun to retreat, burned away by the pale fingers of sunlight, stretching through the village, casting long hesitant shadows. The day had taken on an unsettling stillness, as though the very air was waiting. By mid-morning, she made her decision. Maplewood Manor was not far, and the walk would do her good. The air was crisp, the scent of freshly turned soil, lingering as the gardeners prepared for the season's bloom. Mary Mead was waking up, but there was a hush in the air, a certain tension that ran beneath the surface like an unspoken whisper. As she walked through the village, she exchanged pleasantries with the usual faces, Mrs. Evans, hanging out linens, whose fingers hesitated for a fraction of a second, before she responded to Miss Marple's greeting. Young Mr. Johnson, newly returned from London, who smiled, but with a certain preoccupation clouding his eyes. The nuances were subtle, but she noticed them. She always did. Then, just beyond the baker's shop, came the murmurs. "Did you hear? The Marchmonts are having trouble again. That cousin of theirs, the one from London, she's back. After all these years. But why? No one knows, and no one's saying. But it can't be for anything good." Miss Marple slowed her pace ever so slightly, allowing the conversation to slip past her ears as if she had hardly noticed. People rarely realized how much they revealed in idle gossip, how their words could betray more than they intended. The Marchmonts had their share of secrets. Of that she was certain, and as the looming silhouette of Maplewood Manor appeared in the distance, rising above the village like a watchful guardian, she knew with quiet certainty this was not an invitation to tea. This was the beginning of something else entirely, something hidden, something waiting, and trouble, no matter how well concealed, always had a way of finding its way to her doorstep. Beatrice St. Cloud's return after years of estrangement was not just an unusual occurrence, it was an unspoken warning. Miss Marple had lived long enough to know that some absences were self-imposed, while others were enforced by reasons best left buried. And yet here Beatrice was stepping back into the fold of a family that had not spoken her name in over a decade. A curious thing indeed. The knowledge sat uneasily in Miss Marple's mind as she approached the wrought-iron gates of Maplewood Manor, the estate looming before her like a relic from another time. Ivy clung desperately to the high stone walls, its tendrils creeping over the edges like grasping fingers, as if nature itself sought to reclaim what had been abandoned. There was a stillness in the air, not the peaceful sort, but the kind that suffocated. No rustling of the hedges, no movement among the gravel paths where gardeners once toiled. The manor's windows, always open to welcome the morning breeze, were tightly shuttered today, keeping something in, or perhaps keeping something out. When the butler finally answered the door, he did so without urgency, as if he had been expecting her. He was tall, gaunt, and moved with a deliberate precision, his sharp features betraying no emotion beyond the forced civility of his profession. "Colonel Marchmont is expecting you, Miss Marple," he said, his voice clipped, his expression unreadable. The marble floors of the great hall gleamed beneath the dim light of the chandeliers, their glow subdued as though the house itself had dimmed its radiance in mourning. Miss Marple followed in silence, her sharp eyes tracing the elegant but eerily perfect arrangement of the furniture, the drawn-back curtains that seemed to stifle rather than invite, the cold air that coiled around her ankles despite the unseasonably warm morning. Something was wrong in this house. The butler led her into the drawing-room, where the heavy scent of aged wood and something more elusive, something metallic perhaps, hung in the air. The walls bore the stern faces of Marchmont ancestors, their oil-painted eyes seeming to follow her every movement with knowing silence. Through the window she caught sight of Colonel Marchmont himself, emerging from the garden with a calculated slowness, as though dragging unseen weights behind him. His frame was still military straight, his movements measured, his expression locked in a neutrality that did not sit well with the unease in his eyes. He greeted her with a tight smile, motioning for her to sit. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice level, yet it held the quality of a man trying too hard to control it. "I'm grateful you came." Miss Marple settled into the overstuffed armchair across from him, hands folded in her lap, every ounce the picture of quiet attentiveness. But beneath that gentle exterior, her mind was already unraveling the tension in the room, dissecting the pauses, the darting glances, the way the house itself seemed to breathe uneasily. "You mentioned a family matter, Colonel," she prompted, her tone light, almost absent-minded, though every fibre of her being was attuned to his response. Marchmont hesitated, a fraction of a second too long. "Yes," he said finally. "A delicate matter." He inhaled, then exhaled sharply, as though making peace with his words before they left his lips. "My daughter Lucy is not here at the moment, but but the issue concerns another member of our family, Beatrice St. Cloud." Miss Marple gave a slow nod, watching the way his fingers tensed against the arms of his chair at the mere mention of the name. "She has returned," he continued, voice taut. After all these years, the words felt like an admission of guilt rather than a statement of fact. Before Miss Marple could reply, there was a soft rustle at the doorway, a presence. Farther came a voice, smooth yet carefully measured. "May I come in?" Miss Marple turned. A young woman stood poised in the threshold, her figure framed against the dim corridor beyond. Her eyes were an unnatural shade of blue, striking against the pallor of her skin, but it was not their color that gave Miss Marple pause, it was their guardedness, the way they seemed to hold back more than they revealed. She moved with the elegance of someone well trained in restraint, her smile polite but hollow, a portrait of a woman who had learned to wear masks well. "Lucy Marchmont." The girl's gaze flickered toward Miss Marple, lingering only a moment before she lowered herself onto the sofa with effortless grace. Yet despite her practiced poise, there was an unease about her, a tension she kept hidden beneath her polished exterior. Lucy Marchmont acknowledged her with a brief nod. "This is Miss Marple. She has agreed to assist us." The girl inclined her head in greeting, but said nothing more. Miss Marple did not mind. Silence often spoke louder than words. She allowed the moment to stretch, to settle, to breathe. The air between them thickened with the weight of what was unspoken. This house, this family, was holding something back. "Beatrice's return," Miss Marple said at last, breaking the silence, "must be quite the surprise." A muscle twitched in Marchmont's jaw. "It is unsettling." Miss Marple tapped a finger against the arm of her chair, considering. "People seldom return without reason, Colonel, especially after so long." Marchmont did not answer immediately. His daughter, however, lowered her gaze, her fingers tightening ever so slightly in her lap. Something flickered in the air between father and daughter, an unspoken understanding, an invisible thread of tension stretching between them. Before anyone could speak further, the silence was shattered by the distant sound of something falling, a sharp sudden crash. The room tensed, the very walls seeming to inhale. Lucy's hands flinched in her lap. Marchmont's fingers curled tighter against the armrest. Miss Marple merely turned her head slightly, listening, and in that moment, she knew, Maplewood Manor was not merely harboring old family ghosts. There was something alive within its walls, something that had just made its presence known. The game had begun. A dense mist coiled around Blackthorn Manor, slithering through the ancient iron gates and curling around Evelyn Harrow's boots as she stepped out of her carriage. The night was unnaturally quiet, the air thick with a damp chill that clung to her skin. She hesitated, her gloved fingers tightening around the handle of her travel case. It had been years since she last set foot on these grounds, but now summoned by an urgent and cryptic letter from her uncle, she had no choice but to return. The manor loomed ahead, its gabled silhouette fractured against the moonlight, the tall windows black and uninviting. The estate had always carried an air of foreboding, but now something was palpably wrong. The ivy, once carefully maintained, had twisted itself into wild, claw-like tendrils across the stone walls. The fountains stood dry, their marble figures cracked and weathered. There was no sign of movement, no lanterns flickering in the windows, no distant echo of staff bustling about. It was as though the house itself had been holding its breath, waiting. She had barely reached the grand oak doors when they creaked open on their own, revealing the gaunt figure of a butler standing in the dim light of the entrance hall. His face was unfamiliar, hollow cheeks, sunken eyes that barely reflected the candlelight. "You are expected, Miss Harrow," he said, his voice flat, devoid of warmth. Evelyn stepped inside, the heavy doors groaning shut behind her. The grand hall had not changed in structure, yet it felt different, oppressive, almost suffocating. The golden chandelier above cast weak flickering light, as if reluctant to illuminate the space. The tapestries, once rich in color, had faded, their intricate depictions of hunts and feasts now blurred with age. Her gaze drifted to the portraits that lined the walls. They had always unsettled her as a child, the watchful eyes of long-dead ancestors seeming to follow her every step. Tonight, that sensation was unbearable. The air itself carried a weight, as if the house had swallowed its own secrets whole. "Your uncle is in the study," the butler intoned, stepping aside. Evelyn hesitated. The study, the very heart of the manor. As children, she and her cousin Daniel had been forbidden from entering, their curiosity only deepening the room's mystique. Now something about the doorway ahead sent a shiver through her bones. She walked forward, each footstep echoing too loudly against the marble floor. The study door stood ajar, the faint glow of candlelight within. She stepped inside. A heavy mahogany desk dominated the space, lined with old ledgers and half-rolled maps. A glass of brandy rested near the armchair, untouched, the scent of cigar smoke still faintly lingering in the air. But the chair itself was empty. "Uncle," her voice barely carried beyond the walls, silence, then a whisper of movement behind her. A breath of air where there should have been none. She turned sharply, heart hammering, but there was nothing, only the heavy drapes swaying ever so slightly, though no windows had been opened. A cold realization settled in her chest. Somewhere within these walls, something was terribly wrong, and she was already too deep inside to turn back. The weight in the air between them was undeniable, a silent battle fought in glances and hesitations. Colonel Marchmont's fingers twitched against the pen, his hesitation betraying something deeper than mere caution. The will, an unassuming stack of parchment, carried a gravity that far exceeded ink and paper. Davenport stood still, his expression carefully neutral, yet in his eyes there was a flicker, too brief, too controlled. The colonel swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing in a way that betrayed his unease. "Perhaps not," he muttered, placing the pen down with deliberate slowness, as if the ink itself might trap him. "I need to take care of this, of everything." His voice, gruff and burdened, carried more weight than his words alone. Miss Marple watched, silent yet keenly aware of the unspoken currents between the two men. Davenport did not protest, but there was something in the way he inclined his head, the way his fingers flexed at his sides, that spoke of barely contained impatience. The moment hung heavy, a fragile thing teetering on the brink of revelation, but instead of breaking, it dissipated as Davenport turned his heel and exited, the door clicking shut behind him. Miss Marple's gaze settled on the will. It was a simple document, in appearance at least, but the colonel's discomfort had set her mind turning. A missing daughter, an estranged cousin, pieces of a puzzle yet to be laid out fully. She moved toward the desk, fingers grazing the paper's edge. A faint crease in the top right corner, subtle but telling. Someone had handled it recently, too recently. A careless slip, a minor detail, but in her experience, such details were the very threads that unraveled the truth. "Everything is at stake," the colonel had said, but what if it wasn't just an inheritance that was at risk? The morning sun had barely touched the rooftops of St. Mary Mead, when the quiet of the village was shattered by an urgent knock. Miss Marple, seated at her writing desk, paused mid-thought. The commotion outside the manor's grand hall was unlike the usual rustling of servants or the muffled pleasantries of early risers. She set her teacup down, its surface rippling from the distant tremor of hurried footsteps. Something was amiss. Slipping on her slippers, she stepped into the hallway just as Mrs. Radcliffe, the housekeeper, pounded frantically on a closed door. Miss Lucy, please answer me." There was panic in her voice, raw and unrestrained, a sound that did not belong in the slow, deliberate rhythms of the manor. At the top of the stairs, Colonel Marchmont appeared, still in his nightshirt, his face pale, eyes shadowed with exhaustion. Behind him, Reverend Phelps trailed, his expression equally grim. They exchanged a look, unreadable yet weighted, before turning their attention to the door. "Have you heard anything?" the colonel asked, his voice tight with something between fear and urgency. Mrs. Radcliffe shook her head. Not a sound, a pause, a charged silence. Then the Reverend spoke, hesitant. "Perhaps we should fetch the key." "No time," the Colonel interrupted. "We break it down." The words, though spoken with authority, carried an edge of desperation. The two men braced themselves then, with a force that belied their age, threw their shoulders against the wood. A crack echoed through the hallway, the sound of splintering timber as the door burst open. The room was steeped in stillness. Heavy curtains swallowed the morning light, casting deep, shifting shadows. The bed sat at the center, its covers undisturbed, but for the figure lying within them. A body, small, unmoving. Miss Marple stepped forward, her breath steady even as her pulse quickened. The girl's face, bruised, swollen beyond recognition, was a mask of violence, of something that had long since departed from the realm of the living. The nightgown, once pristine, was now a cruel contrast against the darkened skin. Silence reigned. No one spoke. No one moved. Miss Marple let her eyes travel across the room, cataloguing details with precision. The overturned chair near the writing desk, the perfume bottle shattered on the floor, the curtains drawn shut, despite the girl's usual habit of welcoming the morning sun. These were not random disarray, these were signs, pieces of a truth, waiting to be seen. Outside, the village remained undisturbed, oblivious, but within these walls, something terrible had unfolded, and someone, somewhere, was still keeping their secrets close. The air in the dimly lit room was thick, oppressive, as if it carried the weight of something unseen. The candlelight flickered against the cracked walls, casting uneasy shadows that stretched and twisted in unnatural shapes. The window remained latched from the inside, its glass unbroken, yet the room bore the unmistakable signs of a struggle. Across from the bed, the mirror hung crookedly, its ornate frame fractured, with shards of glass strewn across the floor like frozen tears. They glistened under the weak light, their sharp edges catching reflections of faces, faces filled with dread, disbelief, and a growing sense of unease. Inspector Alden Graves stood just inside the threshold, his keen gaze sweeping over the scene. The door had been locked from within, no sign of forced entry, and yet the body lay motionless on the grand four-poster bed, its form stiff, as if frozen in its final moments. A nightgown, pale, almost spectral, clung to the figure, eerily undisturbed, despite the disorder in the rest of the room. Reverend Phelps swallowed hard, stepping closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "Is it her?" His eyes darted toward Miss Harrow, who remained still, her expression unreadable. "It can't be, not like this." "Careful, Reverend." Miss Harrow's voice was calm, steady, but there was an unmistakable edge to it. "We mustn't assume anything." Silence stretched between them, the kind that gnawed at the nerves. Near the door, Miss Radcliffe stood frozen, her fingers gripping the frame as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. Her face had lost all color. Colonel Braithwaite, his shoulders rigid, his face lined with grief, exhaled shakily, "It's her. It has to be." His voice was barely audible, but the certainty in his tone was unshakable. "That nightgown, I'd know it anywhere." Miss Harrow stepped forward, her gaze sharp, assessing. "It might be," she said slowly, carefully, "but we cannot be certain until we see the face." She moved closer to the bed, her eyes narrowing at the bruises, shadowing the victim's throat, and the curious way the broken glass had been scattered, too methodical, too deliberate. She bent down, running her fingers lightly over the shards. "These," she murmured to herself, "were placed not scattered by accident." Her words lingered, but Colonel Braithwaite remained rooted, his eyes never leaving the body, as if he were willing it to move, to prove him wrong. His trembling hand reached out, barely brushing the bedpost. "It's her," he said again, his voice firmer this time, though it trembled with emotion. "Maybe." Miss Harrow's voice softened slightly, but her expression did not. "But we mustn't rush to conclusions. the locked door, the bruising. It's too neat, too controlled. This wasn't chaos, it was a performance. Mrs. Radcliffe found her voice, though it was hoarse with shock. Shouldn't we call someone? Yes. Miss Harrow straightened, her decision made. Inspector Foxwell must be informed immediately. By the time Inspector Foxwell arrived, the house had settled into an eerie stillness. The once grand corridors now felt like an abandoned mausoleum, each creak of the floorboards swallowed by the suffocating hush. He moved swiftly, his polished boots striking the stone floor with quiet precision. When he stepped into the room, he took in the scene with a single piercing glance. The locked door, the perfectly arranged body, the shards of mirror gleaming like predatory teeth beneath the candlelight. He did not ask the obvious question, not yet. Instead, his gaze flickered to the group gathered in uneasy silence. What happened? His voice was low, controlled, but there was an unspoken demand beneath it. Lucy. Colonel Braithwaite's voice cracked as he said her name. He didn't move, didn't look away from the body. Foxwell paused, then turned to Miss Harrow. She stood apart from the others, her hands folded neatly in front of her, unreadable as ever. She was as much a fixture of the manor as the tapestries lining the walls, an observer, ever watchful. "I don't know," she admitted, her eyes scanning the scene, absorbing every detail. "We were waiting for her return, and then this." Foxwell stepped closer to the bed, his sharp eyes tracing the bruises, the careful placement of the limbs, the unnatural stillness of it all. He did not touch anything. "We need to confirm her identity first," he said after a pause. "There's no way to know for certain, not yet." Miss Harrow nodded, but did not look away from the body. "I've seen the signs," she murmured. "It's not the victim that matters. It's the way this was done, the bruising, the broken mirror, every piece of it." She exhaled, barely above a whisper. "Someone wanted us to believe one thing." Foxwell raised an eyebrow. He had worked with Miss Harrow before. He knew that tone. She had seen something that changed everything. "Meaning?" he prompted. Miss Harrow's gaze sharpened. "This body was placed," she said, her voice barely audible. "This wasn't just a murder, it was a message." The study smelled of aged paper and faint tobacco, its dark oak shelves towering over the figures seated in tense silence. The fire in the hearth flickered weakly, casting restless shadows that seemed to shift each time someone moved. Inspector Graves stood near the door, his gloved hands clasped behind his back, eyes scanning every corner with calculated scrutiny. The body had been discovered less than an hour ago, and yet the room carried the weight of decades of secrets pressing down on its walls. Miss Evelyn Clark, the household's longtime governess, sat stiff-backed on the edge of the settee, her fingers intertwined so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Across from her Mr. Sebastian Lockwood, the family solicitor, leaned forward slightly, his glasses glinting in the dim light, his face carefully composed but betraying a tension in his clenched jaw. "The door was locked," Evelyn whispered, her voice nearly lost to the heavy silence. From the inside, Graves exhaled slowly, stepping toward the desk, where the lifeless body of Arthur Weatherby slumped against the polished wood, his head turned at an unnatural angle. The ink bottle had spilled across scattered documents, staining them a deep crimson, but it wasn't ink that marred the pages, it was blood. "And the window?" Graves asked, glancing at the heavy drapes drawn over the glass. "Latched," Lockwood replied, his voice tight. "Just as it was when we broke in." Graves nodded, stepping carefully around the bloodstains, noting the absence of any struggle. It was too clean, too deliberate. His gaze fell to the papers beneath the victim's hand, his last will and testament, now soaked in his own blood. "Convenient," Graves murmured. Evelyn swallowed hard, her hands shaking now. "You don't understand," she said, barely above a whisper. "Arthur received a letter yesterday, something about an old debt, a warning." She hesitated, glancing at Lockwood, whose face darkened ever so slightly. Graves lifted the deceased man's hand, examining the faint bruising around the wrists. Restraint? No, something else. His eyes drifted to the empty glass on the desk's edge, the residue at the bottom thick and murky. Poison, then a staged accident. Who found him? Graves asked, his tone neutral. Evelyn and Lockwood exchanged glances, but it was Evelyn who spoke. I did. When he didn't come down for dinner, I knocked. No response. I fetched Lockwood, and we forced the door. Graves turned, catching Lockwood's fleeting hesitation before nodding. And you saw nothing unusual? Lockwood hesitated a beat too long. Nothing. The lie was subtle, but Graves had spent years detecting such cracks. His eyes lingered on the fireplace, where embers still glowed faintly, yet there was no sign of a fire having been needed earlier in the night. A fresh burn mark marred the grate, the edges of charred paper visible beneath the ashes. A destroyed document. He turned back to the desk, lifting the victim's other hand, their faint ink smudges on his fingers, as if he had been writing something else before his untimely demise. But where was that paper? The locked room, the unfinished letter, the poisoned glass, everything pointed to a crime meticulously crafted, a puzzle laid out for the careful observer, and Graves was nothing if not thorough. Evelyn, he said, his voice deceptively light. Tell me, when exactly did Mr. Weatherby receive that letter? The governess paled, and in that instant, Graves knew, someone in this house had already planned for that question. The air in the parlor was thick with the scent of old wood, and something heavier, fear perhaps, or the lingering shadow of an unspoken truth. Inspector Alden Graves stood by the window, his silhouette stark against the pale light that filtered through the half-drawn curtains. Miss Eleanor Whitmore, her fingers twisting in her lap, sat poised yet brittle in a high-backed chair, her lips pressed into a line that spoke of restraint. Across from her, Mr. Harold Sutton, the family's solicitor, smoothed his cuffs with deliberate care, though his eyes betrayed a nervous flicker each time they darted toward the desk, where the remnants of shattered glass lay, a crystal decanter, broken into jagged shards, its contents long since absorbed into the thick carpet. Tell me again, Miss Whitmore, Graves said, his voice measured, almost too polite. You last saw your sister what time, exactly? Eleanor hesitated, the delay almost imperceptible, but not to Graves. It was late, she murmured. Past 11 perhaps. She said she needed some air. She often walked the gardens at night. It soothed her. Graves nodded, as if considering her words, then turned his gaze to Sutton. And you, Mr. Sutton, when did you last see Miss Margaret? Sutton swallowed, adjusting his glasses. Before dinner, he said carefully. She was in good spirits. He hesitated. I did hear something later, footsteps in the hall, a door closing. I assumed it was one of the maids. Graves' gaze sharpened. Which door? A flicker of something passed across Sutton's face, gone as quickly as it came. The study, I believe. And yet, Graves mused, stepping toward the desk, Margaret never made it to her room. Instead she was found this morning, in the summer house, her wrists bound, her head resting against the cold stone bench, as if she'd simply lain down and never risen again. The coroner estimates, she died shortly after midnight. Silence pressed against the walls. Eleanor's breath hitched, but she said nothing. Graves reached into his pocket, withdrawing a folded scrap of paper. This was found in her sleeve, he said, unfolding it with deliberate care. It appears to be the torn corner of a letter. The ink smudged, but legible enough. You must understand, I had no choice. If you tell anyone, we are both finished. He let the words settle, a rather ominous note, wouldn't you agree? Eleanor's hands clenched together, her knuckles bone white. I don't, you do, Graves interrupted softly. And so does Mr. Sutton, I suspect. He turned, pacing slowly, watching as Sutton stiffened under the weight of the moment. There's an inconsistency in your statements. You said you last saw Margaret before dinner, yet someone saw you leaving the study, well past 11. So I ask again, Mr. Sutton, When did you last see her? Sutton exhaled sharply, as if deflecting. She asked me to meet her, he admitted, his voice hoarse. She was frightened. She said she had uncovered something dangerous, and she didn't know who to trust. She wouldn't tell me more, only that she needed time, and then, he swallowed hard. Then she left. I assumed she had gone to bed, and yet she didn't. Graves tilted his head. You see, Mr. Sutton, it's never the loudest moment that matters in an investigation. It's the silence that follows, the missing footsteps, the empty room, the door left ajar when it should have been locked. Margaret knew something worth killing for. The only question left is, who knew she knew? Eleanor inhaled sharply, but it was Sutton who broke first, his shoulders slumping as if the weight of the truth had finally caught up to him. She found out about the estate, he whispered. The revisions to the will. Graves smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Ah, he said, as I suspected, it always comes back to money. The room seemed to shrink then, the walls pressing in with the suffocating truth that had finally surfaced. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, carrying with it the echo of a life lost, and the whispered confessions of those left behind. With the scent of aged parchment and the faintest trace of damp stone, Miss Eleanor Graves stood silently in the dim hallway, her sharp gaze sweeping over the remnants of a shattered glass vase, the water pooling along the edge of the old rug. The silence here wasn't mere absence of sound, it was a presence in itself, something lurking just beneath the surface, waiting to be disturbed. Mrs. Evelyn Harcourt, the housekeeper, stood just inside the doorway, her hands gripping the folds of her apron tightly, her breath shallow, as if she had been holding it for too long. When she finally spoke, her voice was edged with hesitation. I saw her, she whispered, eyes flicking toward the eastern corridor, where the shadows stretched unnaturally long against the walls. Not long after midnight, just as the clock struck, I was making my rounds when I saw someone who looked like Miss Margaret, moving toward the old study. Eleanor's expression didn't shift, but her mind sharpened, considering the weight of those words. And you're certain it was her? She asked, her voice smooth, almost indifferent, but watching for the cracks in Evelyn's certainty. The housekeeper hesitated. It was dark, she admitted, her fingers tightening against the fabric, but the figure was the same height, the same way of moving. She was in her nightgown, but she moved like she didn't want to be seen. Eleanor absorbed the information quietly, the pieces slipping into place like an incomplete puzzle. Margaret, missing for 2 nights now, seen creeping through the house at an ungodly hour, or was it someone who wanted to be mistaken for her? What happened next? Eleanor prompted, keeping her tone even. Evelyn swallowed, her eyes darting down the corridor, as if afraid something might be listening. I heard a crash, she murmured. Not loud, but heavy, like something falling over, then nothing, just silence. She looked at Eleanor, something unreadable flickering behind her expression. I thought it was nothing. But now, Eleanor let the silence stretch between them, watching how Evelyn fidgeted, how she kept glancing toward the hallway, as if afraid to remember something she hadn't meant to. You said you thought it was nothing, Eleanor finally said, her voice quiet, but unrelenting. Why, has something like this happened before? Evelyn's lips thinned, as though suppressing something bitter. Miss Beatrice, she said at last, her voice nearly a whisper. The cousin, she's trouble, always has been. Eleanor raised an eyebrow. So I've heard, the villagers talk, Evelyn continued, her voice hushed. She was cast out once, and now she's back, but uninvited, sneaking in through shadows, showing up when no one wants her here. And Miss Margaret, she knew things about this house, about that inheritance. If anyone had a reason to, she stopped abruptly, pressing her lips together, as if she had already said too much. Eleanor tilted her head slightly, considering a disgraced relative, an unresolved feud, a missing girl, and now, whispers of an inheritance, one that someone might be willing to kill for. I see, she said, finally, her voice as measured as ever. "Thank you, Mrs. Harcourt. That will be all for now." The housekeeper nodded, though there was a wary look in her eyes, as if she knew this conversation wasn't really over. Eleanor lingered for a moment as she turned toward the grand staircase, her mind working through the details: Margaret's disappearance, Beatrice's sudden return, the argument, the crash. The timing didn't sit right, it was too convenient, and in mysteries like these, convenience was never innocent. The small chapel on the west wing of the estate loomed ahead as she moved forward, its heavy wooden doors slightly ajar. The scent of melted wax and old stone filled the air, and inside, in the flickering glow of candlelight, the Reverend knelt before the altar, murmuring a prayer too quiet to decipher. He did not seem surprised to see her, he simply lifted his head, his eyes shadowed by something unsaid. "Miss Graves," he greeted, voice calm, but laced with something that did not quite belong in a house of faith. She stepped forward, past the rows of empty pews, past the chill that had settled into the ancient walls. "Reverend," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper, "tell me, when was the last time you saw Miss Margaret?" The air inside Ashford Manor was thick with the scent of old parchment and burning wood, the flickering candlelight casting restless shadows against the high wooden beams. Miss Elara Vaughan stood motionless in the corridor, her sharp eyes tracing the subtle disturbance in the thick layer of dust that coated the floor, a single deliberate trail leading towards the locked study. There was something heavy about the silence here, as if the walls themselves bore witness to things unspoken, secrets long buried under the weight of time. Mrs. Winfield, the manor's housekeeper, hovered at the threshold, wringing her hands over the fabric of her apron, her voice thin with unease. "It was well past midnight, Miss Vaughan," she murmured, casting a wary glance down the dim corridor. "I had just put out the last of the candles when I heard footsteps, soft, careful, like someone who didn't want to be heard. And then, I saw her." Miss Vaughan's expression remained unreadable. "You're certain it was Eleanor?" A flicker of doubt crossed Mrs. Winfield's face. "I thought so. She moved like her, had the same posture, the same pale nightdress billowing, as she slipped into the east wing. But then I heard something else, a sound like a heavy bookcase tipping over, something striking the floor hard, and then, silence." Miss Vaughan absorbed the words, her mind threading the details into the larger puzzle. Eleanor Montrose had vanished 2 nights ago, the heiress to Ashford Manor, slipping away into the dark, with no clear explanation. And yet here was a witness, swearing she had seen her after the supposed disappearance. "And you didn't go after her?" Mrs. Winfield hesitated. "I thought it was none of my business." Eleanor and Miss Beatrice had been at each other's throats for weeks. "I assumed it was just another quarrel, and well," her voice trailed off, guilt laced through the unspoken words. Miss Vaughan tapped a gloved finger against her chin, her gaze distant. A missing heiress, a bitter cousin, and now an apparition of someone who should not be here. Something was being staged, but by whom? And for what end? "There's more to this, isn't there, Mrs. Winfield?" she said, her voice quiet but firm. The housekeeper swallowed hard. "It's Beatrice, Miss Vaughan. She's not to be trusted. There are stories, things the villagers say about her. She was disowned once, you know, cast out without a penny to her name. And yet, here she is again, as if nothing ever happened." Miss Vaughan's interest sharpened. An estranged relative suddenly welcomed back into the family fold just before an inheritance dispute. It was far too convenient. "Tell me, Mrs. Winfield," she said smoothly, "what exactly do the villagers say about Beatrice?" The housekeeper's face darkened. "That she dabbles in things better left alone. That she never truly left Ashford Manor, not in the way people think, and that anyone who crosses her—" Mrs. Winfield's voice dropped to a whisper. "Well, they don't stay around long enough to tell the tale." Miss Vaughan let the weight of those words settle before offering a crisp nod. "Thank you, Mrs. Winfield. That will be all." The housekeeper hesitated, as if wanting to say more, but the moment passed and she disappeared down the hall. Alone now, Miss Vaughan cast a glance toward the heavy oak door of the locked study. The dust told her that someone had gone inside recently, and if Eleanor Montrose truly had been here that night, there was only one way to find out why. But as her fingers brushed the cold iron handle, a whisper of unease curled at the edge of her thoughts. Something about this case didn't just hint at deception, it reeked of it. The question was, who was playing the game, and who was merely a pawn? The scent of fresh-cut roses hung in the air, as Miss Evelyn Sinclair stepped into Fairweather Blooms, the small village flower shop where gossip thrived as much as the lilies. Behind the polished counter stood Mrs. Elspeth Harrow, her fingers deftly arranging a bundle of violets, her sharp gaze lifting the moment Evelyn entered. There was always something about Mrs. Harrow. She had a way of knowing things, of gathering whispers the way others gathered petals, pressing them between pages until they became stories of their own. "Ah, Miss Sinclair," she greeted with a knowing smile, though her eyes held a shadowed glint. "I imagine you've come to ask about what happened last night." Evelyn merely raised a brow, folding her gloved hands atop the wooden counter. "I hear things, Mrs. Harrow, but I prefer to confirm them myself." The older woman chuckled, shaking her head. "Then let me save you the trouble. My sister saw Lillian Everleigh running from Blackthorn Manor just past midnight, her cloak barely fastened, her face pale as death. She didn't stop, didn't speak, just disappeared into the mist like a ghost." Evelyn's breath stilled for a fraction of a second. Lillian Everleigh, the only heir to Blackthorn Manor, had vanished once before, 7 years ago, on the eve of her mother's funeral. Now she had reappeared, only to disappear once more. "And you're certain it was her?" Evelyn asked, her tone deceptively casual. Mrs. Harrow leaned in, lowering her voice. "As certain as I am that you won't find her now, and there's more. My cousin, walking past the estate just the evening before, swore she saw Rosalind Everleigh sneaking into the house." Evelyn's expression didn't change, but the name sent a cold coil of suspicion through her. Rosalind, Lillian's estranged cousin, the one who had been cast out of the Everleigh family years ago under scandalous circumstances. Now, just as an inheritance dispute was about to be settled, she was back. "It's rather peculiar, isn't it?" Evelyn murmured, her fingers tracing absent patterns on the wooden counter. "One cousin running out, another creeping in, almost as if they passed each other in the night." Mrs. Harrow nodded gravely. "And strangest of all, Miss Sinclair, my sister saw Lillian in a light cloak, but my cousin swears that the woman who fled Blackthorn Manor was wearing a dark one. Now tell me, what do you make of that?" Evelyn made no immediate reply, but her mind was already pulling the threads tighter, weaving them into something undeniable. One woman, 2 cloaks. Either 2 people had fled that house last night, or someone wanted to ensure the villagers couldn't be certain who had. "Curious," she finally said. "But curiosity, as you know, is the lifeblood of any truth." With a parting nod, Evelyn left the shop, and made her way through the cobbled streets toward Blackthorn Manor, where shadows pooled like ink beneath the towering gables. There was something at play here, an invisible hand shifting the pieces of a grand deception, and she intended to see who was doing the moving. The scent of rain still lingered in the air as Celeste Harrow stepped into the dimly lit florist shop, where rows of freshly cut blooms filled the room with an almost suffocating sweetness. The bell above the door gave a soft chime, but the sound felt oddly distant, swallowed by the heavy quiet that hung over the village since last night's disappearance. Behind the counter, Mrs. Eliza Thorne was arranging a bouquet of lilies, her hands dusted with pollen, her ever-present cheerful smile masking the storm in her eyes. There was always something unsettling about Mrs. Thorne, an eerie knowingness, as if she could see past the veils people wrapped around themselves. As Celeste approached, the woman's fingers paused mid-arrangement, and without even looking up, she murmured, "I suppose you've already heard the whispers, Miss Harrow. Strange business at Ravenhurst Manor, isn't it?" The way she said it, made Celeste uneasy. She knew something. Celeste leaned against the counter, keeping her expression neutral. Strange indeed, Mrs. Thorne, but I'm sure you have something more interesting to share. The florist gave a conspiratorial nod, lowering her voice. My sister swears she saw Evelyn Whitmore flee the house last night, barefoot, disheveled, like she'd seen a ghost. But that's not the strangest part. She hesitated, then added, she also saw someone else, moments later. A woman in a dark cloak. But my dear, Evelyn was already gone by then. So who was the second woman? A flicker of unease passed through Celeste. Two figures, one escaping and another lurking in the shadows. And you're sure it was Evelyn? She pressed. Mrs. Thorne exhaled sharply. Clear as day, but the cloak, she hesitated. There's talk that Evelyn owned only a light-colored one, so why did my sister see her in black? A deliberate deception, or a trick of the light? Celeste filed the contradiction away, nodding her thanks as she stepped back onto the damp cobbled street. The village murmured around her, snatches of half-heard conversations, fragments of rumors that twisted the truth beyond recognition. Every step she took felt heavier, as if something unseen was pressing against her. She turned her steps towards the office of Mr. Alfred Dunn, the estate solicitor, where the weight of old secrets pressed against the air like a lingering storm. Inside, the musty scent of ink and parchment filled the cramped room, and Dunn himself, nervous, pallid, and twitching with barely concealed unease, regarded her with something between reluctance and resignation. Miss Harrow, he greeted stiffly. You've been asking about Evelyn Whitmore's inheritance, I presume? Celeste inclined her head. And about the revised will Lord Whitmore never got the chance to sign. Dunn swallowed hard. It would have disinherited one of them, he admitted finally. Evelyn, or her cousin Margaret. But with Evelyn missing, Margaret's claim could, well, it's all in limbo now. Celeste's pulse quickened. Then there's motive enough for deception, isn't there? Dunn said nothing, but his fingers drummed against the desk, rapid, erratic, like a tell. There's one last thing, he said at last, reaching for a thick envelope. A letter, unopened, left by Evelyn the night she vanished. It's addressed simply to Steek, Cloud. Celeste's breath hitched. That name again. It had appeared before, in hushed conversations, in hurried glances exchanged between the villagers. She extended a hand. May I? Dunn hesitated, then slid the envelope across the desk. As Celeste tore it open, the room itself seemed to hold its breath. A single sheet of paper, its ink smudged as though written in haste. St. Cloud is watching. The mirror was only the first warning. If I disappear, it wasn't by choice. Find the key. Find the door. The truth is behind it. A sharp gust rattled the window pane, and the words seemed to burn into Celeste's mind. The mirror, the one in Evelyn's room, the one that had been shattered the night she vanished. An accident, or a message. Celeste barely paused to bid Dunn farewell, her mind racing as she made her way to Ravenhurst Manor. The house loomed in the twilight, its silhouette stark against the darkening sky. Inside, the silence was unnatural, the kind that pressed against the skin. She made her way to Evelyn's chamber, and there it was, the broken mirror, jagged shards still littering the wooden floor. Kneeling beside them, Celeste reached out, and her fingers brushed against something out of place, a missing shard, hidden beneath the bed. But it wasn't glass, it was metal, a fragment of something much older, etched with strange curling symbols, a key. But to what door? Before she could ponder further, a shadow flickered in the hallway. Celeste turned sharply, her breath catching in her throat. Someone had been watching her, and now, they were gone. Foxworth leaned against the grand fireplace, its embers barely glowing in the dimly lit drawing room. His fingers traced the intricate carvings on the mantel as his thoughts whirled, assembling the fragmented pieces of a puzzle that refused to fit. The body, the shattered mirror, the staged deception. Every clue seemed designed to mislead, every revelation leading only to more questions. Across the room, Miss Vesper stood poised near the window, the dying light casting long shadows across her sharp, calculating gaze. Her voice, calm, yet commanding, barely disturbed the oppressive silence. The body is a distraction, detective. A performance designed to divert our attention from the real crime. Foxworth exhaled sharply, running a hand through his disheveled hair. If someone wanted to swap Beatrice for Lucy, or vice versa, it means they needed the confusion. But why? His eyes narrowed as he turned toward her. Who benefits from this uncertainty? Vesper didn't answer immediately. Instead, she knelt beside the shattered mirror, her fingers ghosting over the jagged glass. Something made her pause, an anomaly amid the chaos. She plucked a single shard from the floor, holding it up against the light. Her brow furrowed. "This one's different," she murmured. Turning it over, she revealed a faint, nearly imperceptible streak of red, like a whisper of color trapped within the glass. Foxworth stepped closer, intrigued. "Fibers," he muttered, taking the shard from her, studying the delicate strands embedded in its edge. If the victim struggled, they might have caught onto the glass. But if the killer was wearing red, his voice trailed off as the realization took hold. Vesper's lips pressed into a thin line, then they left a trace without knowing it. A mistake. Before Foxworth could speak, a frantic knock shattered the silence. The heavy oak door groaned open, revealing a pale-faced maid, her hands twisted together in distress. "Sir, it's Colonel Ashford." He collapsed in the library. The library was a suffocating place, a vault of history wrapped in the scent of ink and aged leather. The air carried the weight of untold secrets, of words never spoken. Colonel Ashford lay slumped in a velvet armchair near the fireplace, his breath shallow, his pallor ghostly. His trembling hands clutched a crumpled letter, the paper damp with sweat. His eyes, wide with something far more unsettling than mere fear, darted wildly between Foxworth and Vesper as they entered. Vesper approached slowly, her voice unwavering yet gentle. "Colonel, what happened?" Ashford swallowed hard, his fingers tightening around the paper as if it held the last tether to his sanity. "I didn't think it would come to this," he rasped. His hands trembled as he relinquished the letter to her. The ink was smeared, the handwriting erratic, the message chillingly simple. "You know what happened to Lucy? Pay the price, or you're next." Foxworth felt the weight of the words settle in his chest like a lead weight. "Blackmail," he muttered, "or a warning." Vesper's gaze flicked toward the colonel, sharp as a blade. Not just a warning, a declaration. The colonel let out a ragged breath, his voice barely above a whisper. "They know about Lucy, about everything." His gaze flickered toward the desk, where scattered ledgers lay open, pages filled with numbers, transactions, details that spoke of financial dealings deeper and more dangerous than anyone had suspected. Foxworth followed his gaze, flipping through the records, his expression darkening with each page. The sums didn't match, the gaps were glaring. There were missing funds, missing people. "This isn't just about money," Foxworth said grimly. "Someone is erasing their tracks." Vesper wasn't looking at the ledgers, her focus had shifted to something else, something subtler, more damning. The colonel's sleeve bore a faint stain of red ink, not fabric, not blood, ink. She turned to Foxworth, her fingers tightening around the crumpled note. "Detective," she said softly, "the person who wrote this was in this room." Foxworth's pulse quickened. The pieces were falling into place. The locked room murder, the financial deception, the shifting identities. It was no longer just about the death of a woman. It was about something much bigger. The real game had only just begun. Foxworth leaned against the grand desk in the study, his fingers tapping absently against the polished wood, as he sifted through the ledgers laid out before him. The figures sprawled across the pages were troubling: estates, inheritance, and sums far larger than expected. Much larger. This wasn't just a matter of contested wills or family disputes over land. No, there was something deeper, something sinister lurking beneath the surface. He cast a glance at Miss Vesper, who stood by the window, her keen eyes fixed on the courtyard below, as though watching for unseen movements in the dark. "Colonel Ashford has been hiding something," Foxworth murmured, flipping through the pages. "These numbers, they aren't just high, they're desperate. Whatever is at stake here is worth more than property, it's control." Miss Vesper turned, her expression unreadable, as she stepped closer, scanning the documents in his hands. "Control, or fear," she corrected, her voice carrying an edge of certainty. "Fear makes people do strange things, Detective. Fear turns men into thieves, turns families against each other." Before Foxworth could respond, a sharp knock on the door shattered the moment. The maid, pale and breathless, hesitated at the threshold. "Sir, something's happened." They followed her through the dimly lit corridors, the house eerily silent save for the echo of their hurried steps. As they reached the far end of the hallway, the library door stood ajar, and inside, Colonel Ashford sat slumped in a leather armchair, his face ashen, a letter crumpled in his trembling hand. Foxworth crouched beside him, speaking low. "Colonel." The old man's breath came in shallow gasps, his eyes darting between them, his grip tightening on the paper, as though it were the last thing tethering him to reality. He swallowed, voice rasping as he managed, "They know." Miss Vesper took the letter, her brow furrowing, as she read the smeared ink. "You know what happened to Lucy. Pay the price, or you're next." Foxworth exchanged a glance with Vesper before turning back to the Colonel. "What are they after?" The Colonel's gaze flickered toward the desk, toward the ledgers, the incomplete transactions, the missing sums. The silence was suffocating. "Not money," he whispered, almost to himself. "It's not about money anymore." The words settled between them, heavy with implication. Foxworth flipped through the ledgers again, his mind racing. The gaps in the numbers weren't just mistakes, they were deliberate omissions, trails being erased. But why? A voice from the hallway cut through his thoughts. Miss Vesper stiffened as she caught the low murmur of a hushed conversation. Moving swiftly, she stepped into the corridor, her sharp gaze landing on two figures standing in the dim glow of the wall sconces. Mrs. Radcliffe, the housekeeper, and Mr. Davenport, the family solicitor. Their words were tense, urgent. "I'm telling you, Davenport," Radcliffe hissed. "You pushed him too hard. There was no reason to force his hand now." Davenport's voice was cool, measured. The Colonel had no choice. He had to sign. "The estate, damn the estate." Radcliffe's voice rose before she reined it back in, glancing over her shoulder. "You don't understand what you've done." Vesper remained in the shadows, listening. The weight of their words painted a picture far darker than mere inheritance squabbles. Someone was playing a dangerous game. Someone was running out of time. But the answers weren't here, not yet. Vesper turned back toward the stairs, her thoughts already racing toward the one place still left unexplored, the locked bedroom, Lucy's room. The space had remained untouched since the night of the incident, a place frozen in time. When Vesper stepped inside, the air was thick with the scent of dust and secrets. The bed, meticulously made, betrayed no signs of disturbance, and yet the energy of the room felt wrong, off-kilter. She walked slowly, her eyes scanning every inch, every forgotten detail. The broken mirror still lay in jagged fragments upon the floor, its edges glinting sharply in the pale moonlight seeping through the curtains. Vesper crouched down, fingers ghosting over the frame. Then she paused. Something wasn't right. One side of the wooden border was more splintered than the rest. Not from the fall, not from impact, from force. She leaned closer, tracing the faint scratches along the wall behind it. A pattern, a disturbance. The mirror had been moved. But why? A shift in the air sent a prickling sensation down her spine. She wasn't alone. From the shadows beyond the doorway, unseen eyes were watching, and whoever they belonged to had no intention of letting her uncover the truth. Miss Vesper's fingers skimmed the cool, painted wall, her touch feather-light yet purposeful. Then she felt it, an almost imperceptible draft, seeping from somewhere it shouldn't. She straightened, eyes narrowing. The windows were shut, the fireplace cold, the air was slipping through from somewhere else. A hidden passage, the thought locked into place like the final piece of an unsolvable puzzle. She pressed against the panel, feeling for any weakness, and then a faint give. The door wasn't just part of the wall, it was something more sinister, something forgotten. Her pulse quickened. If someone had used this passage, it meant they had a way in, and more importantly, a way out. Before she could act, a sound behind her made her turn sharply. In the dim light of the doorway, Mrs. Henshaw, the housekeeper, stood frozen, her face pale and unreadable. "You know, don't you?" Miss Vesper's voice was a whisper, but it carried weight. The older woman's hands trembled as she clutched her apron. "Not here," she murmured, casting a wary glance over her shoulder. "Come with me." The narrow corridor behind the false wall was suffocating, thick with dust that softened their footsteps. The air smelled stale, tinged with mildew and the heavy weight of time. Miss Vesper held her breath, running her fingers along the cold stone walls, feeling the centuries of secrecy embedded in them. This wasn't just a forgotten servant's passage, it had been used recently, a smudge of dirt, too fresh against the undisturbed floor. Then something else, footprints. Small, hesitant, yet undeniably there, leading toward the far end of the passage, where the darkness swallowed the path whole. "This leads outside?" she asked. Mrs. Henshaw hesitated, then nodded. Through the old pantry, beyond the garden hedge, a perfect escape route. Whoever had been here had left no trace, except for the whisper of their presence in the dust. Miss Vesper knelt, studying the prints. Not a man's too delicate, not the Colonel's, not Foxworth's. Someone smaller, lighter, a woman, a child. Her pulse quickened. As the locked door had been a distraction, an illusion designed to mislead, the killer, or the victim, had never been trapped. They had slipped away into the night, unseen. Miss Vesper stood slowly. Who was in this house that night? Mrs. Henshaw. The housekeeper's face twisted in hesitation, her fingers tightening on her apron, as she glanced away. "Miss Vesper," she whispered, her voice fragile as old paper, "there are things best left buried." "Not anymore," Miss Vesper replied, stepping closer, her gaze piercing. "You saw someone, didn't you?" Mrs. Henshaw's lips parted, her breath shaky. But before the words could leave her mouth, a sharp noise echoed from beyond the passage. A door closing. Someone was listening. Miss Vesper's spine stiffened, every nerve in her body alert. Slowly, deliberately, she reached for the flashlight, its weak beam slicing through the thick dark. "We're not alone," she murmured. The walls of Ashcroft Hall had held their secrets for decades, but now someone was willing to kill, to keep them that way. Mrs. Henshaw's voice trembled, barely a whisper. "A figure in red," she confessed, eyes darting toward the dim corridor. "It slipped through just after the crash. I thought it was Miss Eleanor. She often wears a red silk robe at night." Miss Vesper's sharp mind latched onto the detail. "But you didn't really believe it was her, did you?" The housekeeper hesitated, fingers clutching her apron as though grasping for courage. "No," she admitted finally. "Something about it wasn't right. It was too fast, too deliberate. I was afraid, Miss Vesper. I didn't want to interfere." The detective leaned forward, her voice steady, urging her on. "But it could have been Beatrice," she said softly, "wearing Eleanor's clothes." A visible shudder ran through Mrs. Henshaw. "I never considered that," she whispered, her voice edged with uncertainty. "But now that I think about it, yes. The way she moved, the way she vanished, it wasn't Eleanor." Miss Vesper's thoughts accelerated, pieces snapping into place. The red fibers on the broken mirror, the flicker of movement in the corridor, the confusion surrounding the body, it was all orchestrated, a web of misdirection meant to make everyone believe the victim was Eleanor. But why? Who stood to gain from that deception? The housekeeper wrung her hands, eyes pleading, "Please, Miss Vesper, don't let them know I saw. I should have spoken up sooner, but I was afraid. I thought if I stayed silent, I wouldn't make things worse." Miss Vesper gave a measured nod, though her mind was elsewhere. The truth, however late, was still the truth. "We can't change what's done, Mrs. Henshaw," she said gently, "but the truth is the only way forward now." Miss Vesper rose, her mind a storm of deductions. The red figure in the passage, the hidden door, the inconsistencies in what people thought they saw, it was all deliberate, an attempt to mask the true victim and lead them away from the real culprit. The crime was no ordinary murder. It was a carefully constructed deception, a performance designed to mislead at every turn, and yet the final piece was still missing. One more clue, one more slip, and the killer's fragile illusion would shatter. Outside, the vicarage stood in the pale glow of the dying sun, its shadow stretching across the neatly kept garden. The house exuded quiet humility, yet tonight an unshakable heaviness clung to the air. A storm was coming, not one of rain and wind, but of revelation. Miss Vesper knocked once. The door opened almost instantly, revealing Reverend Phelps, his face lined with exhaustion. "Miss Vesper," he greeted, his tone carefully neutral. "What brings you at this hour?" She stepped inside, the warmth of the fire doing little to dispel the chill creeping through her bones. "I've uncovered something," she said. "A hidden passage in the manor, one that leads from the servants' quarters to the main bedrooms." She paused, watching him. "And I found muddy footprints. Fresh ones." The vicar's reaction was slight, but telling, a flicker of hesitation, a momentary tightening of his jaw. "A hidden passage," he echoed, feigning surprise. "That's unsettling." His eyes darted briefly toward the grandfather clock, a gesture so fleeting most would miss it. But Miss Vesper didn't. He was nervous. "Hiding something." "Yes," she continued, keeping her voice level. "And I found red fibers in the shattered glass. You see, someone wanted us to believe Eleanor was the victim. But was she?" Silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken truths. Then the vicar exhaled, rubbing his temple. "Lucy came to me," he admitted finally. "She was afraid of Beatrice. She told me she'd stop at nothing to claim what she thought was hers." And now, he trailed off, his expression darkening. Miss Vesper studied him, piecing together the final threads. The crime was no longer just a murder, it was a grand illusion, and the truth was just within reach. A dark night, where even the moon hid behind the clouds, shrouded Maplewood Manor in another layer of secrets. Miss Eleanor Graves traced a slender finger over the brittle pages of an old diary, her eyes flickering with an unspoken urgency. In the dimly lit corner of the room, Inspector Aldous Finch watched her with a knowing smile. "Found something?" he asked in a low voice. Eleanor's lips curled ever so slightly. "This isn't just a collection of old memories, Inspector. It's evidence." She turned a delicate page, revealing a cryptic note scrawled in a trembling hand. "The truth lies behind the mirror." It was written by the very woman whose murder still haunted the manor, Victoria Alden. Her blood still stained someone's hands, but whose? Finch picked up the diary, his face momentarily hardening into stone. "Behind the mirror," he murmured. Just then, a sharp noise shattered the silence in the hallway, like something or someone had fallen. Eleanor spun around, eyes wide, as the doorknob trembled ever so slightly. Someone was listening, someone wanted this secret buried. Finch shot to his feet, flicking on his torch. The door creaked open, and a flicker of red melted into the shadows of the corridor. Eleanor inhaled sharply. "Red, that's the same color seen on the night Victoria was killed." Finch stepped forward, his gaze piercing the darkness, but only silence remained. Yet this was just the beginning. What lay ahead would send an unspeakable chill down the spine of everyone within the manor, because it wasn't just the shadow in the red cloak that lurked in the dark. A long-buried truth was waiting to rise. The flickering chandeliers of Blackwood Hall cast restless shadows across the faces of those assembled in the grand drawing room, each figure a prisoner of their own secrets. Detective Eleanor Graves stood at the center, her sharp eyes dissecting every expression, every nervous twitch. Outside the storm howled, rattling the ancient windows, as if urging the truth to break free. Lord Ashford, his once commanding presence now reduced to a trembling figure, sat rigid in his chair, his fingers wrapped tightly around the armrests. Beside him, Mrs. Carraway, the ever-watchful housekeeper, twisted the folds of her apron, her gaze darting toward the mirror above the grand fireplace, the very mirror that had concealed the manor's darkest secret for years. It had shattered the night Isla Ashford was murdered, her final breath lost beneath the heavy velvet drapes, her death ruled an accident. But she lifted a delicate time-worn note between her gloved fingers, and read aloud, "If I vanish, the truth hides where no eyes can see." The room stiffened. The mirror, its reflection had been a lie, hiding a concealed passage that only the murderer had known. The air thickened with unspoken horror. The killer ensured no one would ever find her. But they underestimated one thing: secrets never stay buried. A sudden crash echoed from the corridor. A door creaked, a shadow moved, and then a slow, deliberate knock. Eleanor turned, her grip tightening around the revolver at her side, as the drawing-room doors swung open, revealing Inspector Langley. Rain dripped from his overcoat as he stepped forward, holding up a bundle of damp fabric, a crimson robe, still stained with the blood of the victim. "We found this beneath the yew tree," he announced, his voice a measured calm against the rising storm outside. A sharp intake of breath from Lord Ashford. Mrs. Carraway turned pale, and somewhere in the depths of Blackwood Hall, the truth long silenced was about to be unleashed. Storm outside clawed at the windows of Blackwood Manor, each gust of wind rattling the panes like the breath of something unseen, pressing against the fragile glass. Inside, the grand drawing room, once a place of stately decorum, had become a chamber of silent accusations. The air hung thick, heavy with the weight of too many unspoken truths. Inspector Alden Graves stood at the center, his sharp gaze moving from one face to the next, reading the fear, the deception, the desperate hope that perhaps, somehow, the truth might remain buried. But there would be no more illusions tonight. Near the fireplace, a veiled woman sat still, her hands clasped in her lap, too still, as if she knew the moment she moved, the facade would shatter. "Miss Holloway," Graves said, his voice calm, deliberate. Or should I say, the woman pretending to be Miss Holloway. A ripple of shock passed through the gathered suspects. Lord Everston, normally a pillar of composure, stiffened. Mrs. Whitmore, the housekeeper, wrung her hands, her eyes darting to the heavy drapes, as though the walls themselves whispered secrets. Mr. Langley, the late Lord's solicitor, exhaled slowly, his fingers tightening around his cane. The veil trembled, then lifted. A single collective gasp. Isabel Carlyle, not the grieving heiress, but the mastermind of an intricate deception. "It was never about inheritance alone," Graves continued, pacing slowly. "It was about erasing someone, taking their life, their place, their name. The body found in the study, battered beyond recognition, was not Miss Holloway. It was a decoy, carefully staged to mislead us all." The fire flickered violently, casting jagged shadows across the polished wood floor. "You wore her clothes," he went on, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "You used the hidden passage behind the mirror to escape, leaving the illusion of a locked room behind. A brilliant ruse, except for one mistake." Isabel's lips curled, her gaze unreadable, but Graves pressed on. "The fibers in the mirror shards," he said, voice like iron, "from the red robe, the same robe you were seen wearing that night." A sharp inhale from Reverend Giles, a flicker of something unreadable in Langley's expression. The air crackled with unseen tension. Outside, something shifted. A floorboard groaned beyond the locked doors. The storm howled. Within these walls, a darker reckoning stirred. Graves' fingers hovered near his revolver. The truth was no longer a matter of deduction. It was coming for them all. The veil slipped away in one seamless motion, revealing the woman beneath, a face long presumed lost to the shadows of deception, Marian Lockwood. Her sharp, calculating eyes locked onto Detective Evelyn Graves, unreadable, unwavering. There was no flicker of panic, no trace of guilt, only the cool composure of someone who had foreseen this moment, had anticipated every possibility, and still believed she could emerge unscathed. But the weight of the truth had finally caught up. The room, once grand, now suffocating under the burden of revelation, was utterly silent. Even the storm outside seemed to pause, as if the night itself was holding its breath. Lord Harrington, his fingers digging into the arms of his chair, swallowed hard. Mrs. Bellamy, the housekeeper, clutched the edge of the table, her eyes darting wildly, as if grasping for something unseen. Mr. Langford, the estate's solicitor, exhaled sharply, a shadow passing over his features. The moment stretched, brittle as glass, and then Evelyn spoke. "Not Eleanor Harrington, as you wanted us to believe," she said, her voice deceptively soft. "No. That was the lie that carried this game. You, Marian, orchestrated it all. The body found in the cellar, disfigured beyond recognition, was meant to be mistaken for you, but the truth has sharp edges, and you've cut yourself on them." A slow, mirthless smile played at Marian's lips. "So clever," she murmured, "and yet you still don't see it all, do you?" The fire crackled violently, casting jagged shadows along the velvet drapes. Someone shifted near the doorway. The air thickened. Evelyn tilted her head slightly. "You wanted the Harrington estate, the wealth, the power. You wore Eleanor's clothes, took her place, manipulated the inheritance, and ensured that the real Eleanor, your own sister, would be forgotten, buried in silence." A sharp inhale from Mr. Langford. The truth was unraveling too quickly now, slipping like sand through desperate fingers. Evelyn took a slow step forward. "But you weren't alone, were you?" She turned, eyes locking onto the one person who had been too quiet all along. Langford. The shift in the atmosphere was immediate. The color drained from his face, his fingers tightening around his cane. "You," Evelyn said, the accusation slicing through the room. "You staged the will, concealed the ledger entries, ensured that no one would question the transition of power, and all it took was a single mistake." Silence. Then Langford whispered, barely audible, "The ledger." Evelyn nodded. "The ink on the last amendment, too fresh, the smudging. You rushed it, didn't you? Thought no one would notice." Marian's expression hardened. The game had slipped beyond her control. "It doesn't matter," she said smoothly. "The estate is mine, the deed is done." Evelyn held her gaze, unflinching. "No, Marian, it's over, because what you never accounted for, what you couldn't anticipate, was that Eleanor planned for you." The room seemed to freeze. And then from the hallway, footsteps. Slow, deliberate. A figure stepped into the dim candlelight, and the storm outside roared as Eleanor Harrington walked back into her own home. The weight of deception hung thick in the air, pressing against the walls of Hawthorne Hall like an invisible force. Lord Everleigh sank into his chair, his trembling fingers barely gripping the glass of brandy in his hand. His voice, when it finally came, was brittle, strained. "I never suspected him," he whispered, the words barely making it past his lips. "I knew something wasn't right, but Philip—" He stopped, unable to finish the thought. Philip Everleigh, his own son. The betrayal was too much to bear. Across the dimly lit drawing room, Lady Eleanor stood by the fireplace, her face eerily pale against the flickering light. She had been the quiet observer, always watching, always knowing more than she let on. But even she had not seen the depth of the deception. He played us all, she said finally, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her eyes. And now, Lucy is gone. At the mention of the name, silence fell over the room like a shroud. The weight of grief, of regret, of the horrifying realization that Lucy had never truly been safe, pressed upon them all. Near the window, Mr. Caldwell, the estate's longtime steward, clenched his jaw, his hands twitched at his sides as if grasping for something, perhaps the past, perhaps absolution. I should have seen it, he muttered, shaking his head. He was always clever, too clever. Detective Eliza Harrow, standing just inside the doorway, surveyed them all with sharp, unwavering eyes. Clever, she repeated, stepping forward. Yes, but clever men often make mistakes. And Phillips was underestimating Lucy. She let the words settle, watching as the realization took root. Slowly the fear in Lady Eleanor's expression shifted. Uncertainty, disbelief, then the faintest flicker of something else. Hope. Lord Everleigh's grip tightened around his glass. Lucy, Eliza nodded. She knew. That's why she left the note, hidden in the pages of the ledger. The ink was faint, smudged, as if written in haste, but it was enough. She knew Philip would come for her, that he would make it look like an accident. Her gaze turned to the grand mirror on the far side of the room, its fractured surface a testament to the struggle that had taken place here. She fought him, Eliza continued. She broke the mirror, shattered it into a dozen pieces, and that's when she ran. The room held its breath. And then the sound, faint, almost imperceptible at first, a creaking floorboard. Every head turned toward the shadowed hallway beyond the open door. A figure emerged, slow, deliberate, stepping into the dim candlelight. Lucy Everleigh, alive, disheveled, bruised, but standing. Philip had failed, Lady Eleanor gasped, rushing forward. Lucy, but Lucy's gaze wasn't on her. It was locked onto the one person who had orchestrated it all. Philip Everleigh. He stood frozen at the threshold, his once pristine composure finally cracking, the weight of his downfall settling on his shoulders. Eliza turned to him, voice calm but firm. You thought you could erase her, that no one would question it, but the truth, Philip, the truth never stays buried. The fire crackled, the house itself seemed to exhale, as Philip's fate sealed itself in the heavy silence. As the constables stepped forward to take him away, Lucy finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. He thought he could steal my life. A pause, then her eyes met Eliza's. But I was always meant to survive.